LinkedIn. This is ML's Like Teen Spirit. Today we have Mark Steadman with us. Mark, how are you doing?
I am very well, thank you.
Good. Mark,
Honoured to
thanks
be
for
here.
joining. Yeah, great. Mark, I'm building a world map of my guests. I forgot to mention this to you in the prep. I hope you're joining me from somewhere exotic. Where are you, please?
Oh, it's so exotic. I'm joining you from the sunny West Midlands, the best Midlands, TM, Birmingham.
Good. Haven't got a pin in Birmingham, so I'm going to add one. Thank you for that. So look, Mark, we're a show about data science, data, and how it applies in the real world. I was interested to have you on this show. Two reasons. Firstly, we've never met before. We prepared for this, so thank you for your support and thank you for joining. And secondly, that you have a really interesting story, and in fact, you're a bit of a mover in the podcast space. And I'd like you to I'd like you to introduce yourself really. So I ask everyone that comes on for the first time, just spend like 90 seconds, tell us what you've done, how you got to this point, and then we'll pick up the story from there, please.
Okay. I am very much a stickler for obeying by the rules, so I've already started a 90-second timer. My name is Mark Steadman, and I help people make podcasts. I'm describing myself currently as a podcast problem solver because I like to work across the whole gamut, really, from the creative side, helping people come up with good ideas that listeners haven't heard before, all the way through to how we actually implement that and turn that into stuff that people are going to hear and that's going to land. I had a technical background. I studied radio and media and communication at university, which took me through online radio and that kind of stuff. Took a detour into tech for quite a few years and was like a web designer and web developer and apps and all that kind of stuff. And then got fully back into being paid to make podcasts since 2016 and helped start them. I founded, ran and sold a podcast hosting company started in 2016, finished all that in 2021. And now I spend my days consulting, making shows, having fun, trying to learn new things. And that is basically me. And I think I have 15 seconds left, but I think that'll do us.
Mark, thank you for that. I'll tell everyone watching this that actually we've overrun massively on the preparation and used the entire meeting schedule that we had arranged on just talking, putting the world to rights on various topics. So look, don't worry too much on the time. Mark, you're an expert in the podcasting space. Thank you for joining. I'm not really sure if what we're on right now is a podcast. Amen to the fun part. I started this because I wanted to not be part of the AI mania in terms of in LinkedIn and some of these things. So I really wanted to speak to real people and challenge myself to connect with others. But you're a real podcast expert. And what I talk about here is try and have people we're data orientation. So we're going to have to get down to it. So I'm interested in hearing about, when you're, starting the podcasts, monitoring the podcasts, looking at their success, what data are you using? You've done it for such a long time. It would be, interesting to know how it was those years ago when you started your business compared to how it is today. But perhaps start us off from the beginning, just kind of measures and metrics. Like what are the things that you look at? I'm embarrassed to say I don't look at much because my ego can't take it. But like, what should I be looking at in terms of my metrics?
Okay, so couple of points of definition then. So people get they get all sorts of upset about this, but essentially the way I define a podcast is audio or video that is delivered via means that we call RSS. And if you don't know what that means, that's absolutely fine. Basically, if your show can be accessed in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, then it is a podcast. If it can't be accessed in those for various reasons, I would not consider it a podcast. That does not devalue it. That does not mean it's not a valuable thing. It's just that's the definition that we're working under. And so the reason that's important is podcasting has its own set of data and its own set of challenges around that data as well. So if we contrast that with something like YouTube, for example, YouTube has lots and lots and lots of data because they track it and you are encouraged to watch YouTube with an account. And so that's information that they can peg to specific people. And so YouTube has always had quite a lot of information that we can learn about how long people watch videos for and that kind of stuff. And so we'll get to that in a little bit. Us over here in podcasting land, the tech hasn't much evolved from when it started in 2004. So what happens is you take your piece of audio, most commonly it's audio, sometimes it can be video, but most podcasting is audio. You upload that to what we call a podcast hosting company. And so if you've heard of Spotify for podcasters, that is what they do, for example. And so you drag some audio into a box and you publish and you send your show to Apple and Spotify and to Amazon and to lots of other places. When someone downloads that episode, or when someone listens, that episode is downloaded. People call it streaming. Typically, it actually isn't. It's the episode is downloaded either in part or in full. And from that, we can then infer where we think you are in the world, down to usually a city level, and a little bit about maybe the device that you're listening on. So typically, we can find out what app you're using because the app tells us. And what device you're looking at, listening to the podcast on, whether that's an iPhone or an iPad or a Mac, a PC, whatever. And so we get a little bit of that information along with the location, and that's what we've had for the entirety of podcasting, is just that sort of vague sense of location, and that's it. We haven't had, because we don't have the metrics for it, a sense of how long people listened, when they stopped, even if they did listen. All we actually definitively know is the episode on someone's device. That's all we know. And so that is for the vast majority of podcasting up until a couple of years ago. That is the information that we had. And that's what's fueled podcast advertising and everything. It's all based on, is this episode landing, is the file actually landing on people's devices?
So, Mark, I always I always like to try and ask a question that we didn't prepare for, just to keep guests on their toes. The location part. Could I ask you, have you ever been looking at your maps or your location data? Like, what's the wildest place you've ever seen a podcast being listened to? Have you ever seen like Antarctica or something, or up at Everest or Bora Bora or somewhere absolutely bizarre? Is there any?
There's definitely countries I've never heard of. that I've seen. Yeah, I like to go and look at like what are the ones with like one download. And yeah, you might find a Djibouti or something. I don't know if I've yet. I remember at one point I was big in Japan, as it were. But yeah, you do find, especially with the bigger podcasts, you do find them in interesting places.
So the some of the data has been around forever, it sounds like. What's changed? Because it seems like it's really, as an outsider, it seems really rich now. So what kind of happened, and what new information have you begun to look at the last years?
Yeah, so there's sort of two schools really. There's advertising has long the advertising business has long been very upset at the lack of data that podcasting has got, because I think it sees what YouTube gets and thinks, I want that. I mean, for like over a decade, we were all fine with that, but at some point, advertisers came in and said we should have more data, and so some companies have started trying to find ways of either keeping track of listeners. So if you listen to if you listen to podcasts that are hosted on Acast, for example, you'll know those because there's like a little whooshy sound before the ad plays. Those podcasts, that company is tracking you with its ads, or it's using the tracking data to inform the ads that it sends you. That's why if you listen to a UK podcast in Germany, you'll get an ad in German. And so they're using some kind of data, but we don't necessarily get to use much of that. It informs their marketplace. And so they will infer things like gender and that kind of stuff. In the case of Spotify, Spotify collects that information and it does give us that info. So we can actually look at a very broad demographic of our listenership in Spotify in terms of age, gender, and there's some things tied around music as well. But where things have evolved and become more interesting is Apple and Spotify now give us, there's a couple of different names for this, but listener retention data or listener engagement rates. Basically, we can get a number and a graph that shows us what's the average percentage of the episode that people listen to? So, you may know if you listen to a podcast, once you've sort of you start to hear that they're coming in for a landing, you might be like, okay, done. Like I've got all, I'm happy. Skip to the next one or whatever. And so we can see when that happens. We can see it on a graph to go, right, when we play this bit of music, the listener who's been around for a while is like, oh, I recognize that. They're obviously coming in for a landing. They're obviously closing up the episode. So I'm not going to listen to their call to action. I'm not going to listen to them asking me if I want to be on their newsletter, all that kind of stuff, which is useful for us. And so we now can get a sense of what the percentage rate is that people are completing the episode, and where people might be skipping or dropping off, or in some cases even rewinding the episode to listen back. And so that is information that's a little harder to get, but it's all there. It just takes a little bit more sort of digging into. And so that is provided by the app developers, Apple and Spotify themselves, that isn't available to the company that actually hosts your audio. They don't know that. Again, all they know is that the MP3 file got downloaded, whereas Apple and Spotify are collecting that data and serve it back to us anonymously and aggregated to say, these are the percentage of people who made it through your episode. So that's really, really useful data if you care about trying to make the tightest show that is going to retain and help you grow your audience.
Well, let's try and leave people with a number, Mark. Could I ask you, across all the things you study, work on, listen to, what would be just, if I asked you for an average of a show's retention, like how many people make it to the end, real rough average, I know it can be different, like what kind of number? I've genuinely got no idea. I don't guess.
Yeah, I can't give you an average, but what I can tell you is what a good number to aim for is. So I don't know what the average is. I mean, maybe by law of averages it is 50%, I'm not sure. But I know that typically we believe that if you get around 65 to 70% retention in your episode, then that's good. So anything above sort of 65 is typically a good rate. So again, I couldn't tell you an average that people listen to, but the benchmark that we're going for is around 65%.
Okay. Mark, we've got 2 minutes of this left before we hit my time. I want to ask you a question that about something that caught my eye. So I know the whole world knows who Stephen Bartlett is these days, and he has a popular show.
He's spent a lot of money to make sure that people do. For
real. And but it's caught my eye initially months or years ago that he posted that they have a data scientist on the show, and this is my background. And then about a year later, signposted again, we have a head of experimentation. Now these two things go together quite nicely. Could I ask you to sort of speculate as to what you think they might be doing, what things you can study, measure, compare in the podcast space, just real general terms. I know you don't work there, but like how are they optimizing their show?
So they'll be looking at YouTube probably primarily because they're filming everything, and so they're going to look at and they're going to experiment with episode titles, YouTube thumbnails, descriptions, shorts, so making clips. They're going to want to chop up videos in different ways to see which kinds of clips perform really well. And so they'll be getting data from TikTok and YouTube Shorts and from Instagram and piling all that into reports and things as well. They may already be looking at Apple Podcasts and Spotify to look at the retention information as well and to find out where people are dropping off. That gets a little bit trickier for reasons I won't get into because of dynamic ads and stuff. So I would imagine YouTube is probably what they're looking at most because that's where they can get a good, chunky bit of data to find out where which bits of episodes people are engaging with.
They'll be modifying everything potentially.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like you can't modify a YouTube video once it's up, but it will be data that they can then use. We know that if we leave this beat of silence here, it creates something that's really dramatic. If we leave too much silence, people think the episode's finished, or it will be something that they'll start to. I'm sure they'll start to work towards.
Good. Well, Mark, thanks for taking us through all that. And look, here's the bad news, Mark. The good news is you've survived this interview with me. The bad news is that we're butting up against my time limit. So, Mark, look, thanks for explaining that too. I certainly knew nearly none of this. Thank you for joining me for this and explaining it all. And then, congratulations on all your business things. You've got a stellar background in this, and it's been great to have an expert on. So, Mark, thanks a lot. Ladies and gents, this has been ML's Like Teen Spirit.